Well, Brian, wonderful to see you today. I understand you're out in a place of high trees.
I'm in Palo Alto, the high
Yes,
tree.
yes,
And there are plenty of trees around here. Yeah.
yeah. And I was asking you earlier about the name, and you were saying that it refers to an ancient redwood there.
Yes, it's a particular high tree. It's right by the railroad line, been a little bit damaged by trains over the last 150
Yep,
years, maybe,
it's,
but it's
it's
still around.
fantastic. I'm about to plant a small grove of giant sequoias here in the Sangre de Cristos.
Ah, isn't that fabulous?
Yeah, I'm very
They'll,
excited about it.
they'll be around long after we're forgotten,
Exactly.
John.
Yes, very much so.
How lovely.
But I'm excited because they sequester, each tree sequesters, I understand, that more carbon than I have caused to be emitted during my whole lifetime.
Wow.
Being three trees will kind of multiply that into a triplicate contribution to reversing climate change
Great.
and provide a very beautiful grove of trees
Yeah.
and help preserve the sequoias, which are under duress right now from fire
Yeah.
and climate change. I should probably introduce Brian a little bit. I don't know quite how to introduce Brian because we've known each other for quite a few years. Uh, how far back is it, Brian?
It's exactly 30 years
30 years.
this July. So
Yeah,
30 years plus a little bit.
maybe we can,
And
we
you
can.
can certainly introduce me as a student of yours, John.
Okay. Well, we've been having a wonderful connection together for many decades now. And Brian's a very leading, world leading economist, the father of the theory of increasing returns.
Right?
Done a beautiful book on the origins of technology recently, and has been very active in many ways in helping to bring very novel and creative new insights into economic theory. He may share a little bit around that, but I thought it would be really nice to explore together an aspect of Brian's work in past and training, which has to do with our way of nature process. And I think Brian holds the world record in the number of passages and retreats, many of them longer ones, 3 weeks to a month in some cases, deep retreat in solitude in nature, often here at the Sacred Land Sanctuary. And we did quite a bit of work together down in Baja,
Yes.
California. We run retreats in the winter
Yeah.
until the ATVs took over the beaches.
Mhm.
Um, but it's wonderful having you here, Brian. And I would love to, I think it's a wonderful opportunity for the folks listening or viewing today to receive some of your wisdom and what you've gained through the 3 decades of deep immersion in the way of nature process through these deep retreats and many trainings as well.
Delighted. I'm honored,
Yeah.
John. Thank you.
I should also mention that Brian and I have a fair amount of Irish in my background from the most difficult, god awful climate part of Ireland in the far north. The little peninsula that sticks out of the ocean. What's that place called again?
Donegal.
Donegal.
It's where my ancestors are from too. So
Oh,
I'm sure we're related.
we're probably related. So
Yeah.
we share a certain Irish perspective on life. But I think our Brian is still full bore Irish, whereas I'm maybe 60%. And so in any case, great to have you here. And maybe we could open by asking you how you got involved with the wave nature process and in our work together.
Yeah, this was around 1992. I'd had a lot of training, spiritual training in China with a teacher or Sifu in Hong Kong. And sometime this was from the mid 80s on, so that goes back almost 40 years. And sometime around 1992, I got restless and I was back in California, and instinctively suddenly, not suddenly, but over a period of months, I began to think, wouldn't it be great somehow to train outside, be outside? And at that time, there were things like Outward Bound or the kind of things that programs for executives, the high ropes up in the trees, all this sort of thing. And I thought, that isn't quite me. Could there be an outside experience in nature? I was totally ignorant that was spiritual at the same time. So I started to buy magazines, outdoors magazines, and wilderness magazines, and hiker magazines. I couldn't find anything. And then I looked out. I had met Hannah Strong, who is very prominent in the Crestone area, indeed owns an awful lot of land there. And Hannah invited me to Crestone, and she sent me to meet. She said, there's this friend of mine on the other side of Crestone. He's a Taoist or Taoist. And she said, you'd probably really like him. So she sent me over to meet you, John. I had no idea. I have to admit, this was early 90s. I'd never heard of your program, never had encountered you. But Hannah Strong sent me over to meet you. And I arrived at the gates, walked in. You were putting a group out on a nature retreat, on a solo retreat. And you held the whole program up for about 3 hours to show me all the delights
That's great.
of uh, of the sacred land there. I was very, very grateful. And I think I had one question for you. I said, what do you do, John? And you said, I put people out in nature in a sacred way.
Mm.
And I did the calculation. I thought, they're all going out this afternoon. I've no gear, I've no equipment. So I just blurted out, I said, when are you putting the next group out? And that was a month or two later. And indeed, I went on that. And the
Yeah,
rest is history for me.
yeah, absolutely. By the way, I should mention to folks listening or watching this sharing that Hannah Strong is the wife of
Morris Strong.
Boris Strong, who was the chairperson of the first major conference on the environment in 1972 in Stockholm. And I got to know Hannah or Maurice through our work together. I provided a lot of the case studies, which provided the database for the proof of what was happening to the environment
Yeah,
in wide places, and that was helpful information for that big UN conference. And then when I moved here, I was amazed to find out that my neighbors were Hannah and Maurice.
yeah,
I hadn't really seen them since Sweden, and so we've been friends ever since and done a lot of joint work together. I've been on the board of their foundation for quite a few years and tried to support everything that they're doing and bringing together different spiritual communities that Kristen is so famous for now. But that's a little background to who Hannah is.
yeah,
What an amazing kind of a grandmother of the environmental movement in many ways.
yeah.
And we're fortunate to have her here in our little community of Crestone. So yeah, I have some memories of that. I also remember sitting with you at the Desert Sage. I think it might have had a different name at that time, and having a coffee together. And you shared a few quizzical looks at me. We began to share our mutual histories on the planet together.
I
But
remember early on, John, there was a cafe in Crestone called the Roadkill Cafe. It's quite a
Mhm.
long time ago, aptly named.
Yes, yes, the Roadkill Cafe was a classic. It actually did do that. Um, so we had a little network of people that would bring in roadkill, the, the unfortunate being that had been hit, and then in the restaurant they would serve up after doing a little ceremony and honoring the spirit of the being that had died in such a unfortunate way. They the body was in a sense honored by being celebrated as a part of a meal. And I have a friend, by the way, in the East Coast, Emma Blackwin, who is doing the same thing for clothing, honoring the animal, the death of the animal in an unfortunate way, and then making beautiful clothing out of the road accidents that take place instead of just people running over the body again and again and again. Or some people take the honor of the animal by picking it up and carrying it over to the side of the road. I've been doing that for years. So it's not just they're being pummeled by cars. But she's taken a step further in honoring the actual pelts in the body of the animal. And very much like how indigenous people do with their hunting practices, doing a little ceremony before to invite the spirit of the animal that would like to leave its body. And then when they kill, the hunter's responsibility is to make it clean, so there's minimal suffering or none. And then afterwards, making sure every part of the being is utilized and honored after the Thanksgiving ceremony for the gift of its body. Very different approach than feedlot production in the United States these days. Anyway, you were saying that we had a really nice meal or two and then got together. Where did you do your first passage?
In November 1992, so you were putting people out. This was July, and about 2 or 3 months later, I was able to go out, and this was in Arizona, Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. It was right on the border of Mexico. You can't really go out there anymore on a sacred passage because it's so near the border and therefore dangerous.
Yeah, it's getting kind of dicey down there. Very close to the Tohono O'odham, a Native American land.
Yeah.
It's also right along the border. They're very ancient people that have lived there for a very long time.
Yeah.
They're right next door.
So I was totally amazed. I went out for 8 days solo, and I had never really camped outside alone. I'd done a little bit of camping like most people, but maybe with kids or relatives or something. But I'd never really camped outside alone. I think I was quite frightened. You could hear animals being hunted down by maybe mountain lions in the middle of the night, things like that, and screeches and wailing and
there are even jaguars there.
Yeah. It was absolutely beautiful, gorgeous desert land, bone dry, cold at night, and quite warm, maybe 90 degrees, 80 degrees in the middle of the day. And I do remember this, I'll just add this, John, that I found you could hardly put your foot down without it hitting cholla cactus.
Yeah, cholla cactus is
yeah. And it stuck to your legs, it stuck to your pants, it stuck to your shoes. These are bits of cactus that fall off the main bush. And it seems that their purpose in evolution is to stick to things. So it's very hard to walk around even during the day. After being there in the night, pitch dark, I think you'd given us some exercise where we would walk around pitch dark alone in the middle of the night. And I found for some reason I could do that without paying too much attention and not pick up any cactus. And I could never understand, still can't understand to this day how that was possible. But it gave me an indication that if you are out in nature, even for a short while, like a few days, we acclimatize and we have some sort of sixth sense that merges or melds with nature and acts to protect you. I think that we must have some inside sense where we are actually well attuned to nature, but we cover that up by living in cities and wearing
Yeah.
heavy shoes and things like that.
Yeah. So you find your senses begin to be, as you know, we put a lot of emphasis on how to refine the perceptions and the experience, what we call the 9 experiential fields of sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, energy, experience, movement and balance. And then, of course, the way the emotions and the mind works at the same time. We learn how to refine those, especially those 7 fields of experience prior to emotional and
Yeah,
mental activity. And by refining, in your case, in the desert there, very often you get to a point where you can almost feel or see where the cacti are in the desert and nowhere to place the foot in between the cacti instead of on them.
yeah, but this was unconscious. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah,
And to you, this is second nature. I'd never seen anything like that.
yeah.
Want to add something that, excuse me, but I'd gone out there with a rather tortured question. This was in 1992. I had a fancy job in academia at Stanford University, and I
You were in the
enjoyed.
department there, as I recall.
Yeah, I was an economist at Stanford, and
Yeah.
I had a really top job there. And I enjoyed doing academic work, doing research, and that was my passion. At the same time, I had been told that I ought to maybe give that up and become drop all that and maybe go to China or Hong Kong and devote myself 100% to spiritual training. And I was very tempted to do that, and I felt tugged both ways. Should I stay where my passion was in scientific research, or should I give that up and go to Hong Kong and train a full time with family and children and so on? And I felt tugged in both directions, and I spent 8 days on that particular passage trying to get an answer, and there was absolutely no answer. I came out of this sacred passage solo. I'd been alone for 8 or 9 days, and I had no answer. And about 2 days later, you and I were walking in the canyon, uh, still in this area of Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. And you asked me just privately how had it gone. I said, well, gone extremely well, but I had no answer to the question I brought out. And you said, John, what was the question? And I said, well, should I be 100% training in spiritual matters in Hong Kong, or should I keep that on the side and devote myself to what I really enjoyed, which was research and writing? And you went silent for a while and you kind of looked, blank and as if you were processing something. And then you turned to me about a minute later and you said, and this really changed my life. You turned to me and you said, yes. I said, what do you mean, yes? You said, yes to devoting yourself to spiritual practice, 100%, and yes to doing research, 100%. A really typical John Milton answer. Both you said, and you told me that some people had been brought into this lifetime, if you like, born to do both, to be in the world. In fact, you're one of those people. To be in the world, to be engaged in what's going on, which you've been yourself since the 1960s, maybe before, in the environment and in that sort of political thought, but also to be in the spiritual realm. And it was a remark of yours. I mean, this was just as if you'd tossed this off. But that changed my entire life, John.
Mm.
And fast forward a few years, I was in Baja California, in Mexico, and somebody who's Mexican drove me, I think, to the airport. A very nice person, young man. And he said, I've heard, he said, that you are an economist, but he said, but I've heard that you have a hobby of doing spiritual work, and that this a hobby you really enjoy. He said, is that right? No, I said, that's completely wrong. I said, I'm interested in spiritual development, and that's my main interest. And I have a hobby of doing economics. So, at any rate, that is the difference you've made to my
Yeah.
life, John.
Oh, thank you. That's a wonderful sharing. Beautiful. Now you've done quite a few deep retreats in nature at this point. I think, as we were saying, you hold the world record for sacred passages in the way of nature, and then you've done a number on your own as well.
They add up to exactly 50.
Really?
I've kept a record of when and where. So
That's wonderful.
yeah, it's 50 as of this September.
And I know very often you come to Crestone and do longer kind of custom
Retreats.
retreats for anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks at a time.
Mhm.
And this has become a central part of your spiritual cultivation. And it also has had an effect on supporting your creative side.
Yeah.
And it could be a lot of people don't realize that there's a very strong relationship between creative insight and the upwelling of creative insight that has to do with how the life itself and the issues and questions you have in life, and the degree to which you're able to dive deeply into a deep connection to your true nature or your source aspect, or maybe begin to touch into the Tao. And that as you begin to approach that level of very profound level of spiritual opening, the creativity that from touching in and maybe not even being fully established there, but even on the journey close to that level of very full realization, the creative upwelling is just extraordinary and profound and very supportive of both personal and professional life in many, many ways because of the insights that upwell from that source of pure creativity. Now you've done so much cultivation work in this way, it might be really helpful to share a few of your own insights around how this works, how it's been useful in your own life,
Sure.
personally and professionally, and then maybe a few thoughts for other people that are listening or watching here today.
Yeah, well, typically, just to explain for people who don't know much about the way of nature, one of the things John does is to take us, the people who are part of the way of nature, who join in that, and put us out solo style, maybe for 5 nights or 5 days at a time, maybe for 28 or even 40 days at a time. We were out there cooking or marinating in something much deeper. And my own experience is that, I showed up again and again, sometimes quite casually. I thought, well, my instinct was I should go out in nature again. And John gives us teachings, which I found to be both profound and extremely useful. Very often teachings from Tibetan Buddhism, but from other traditions as well. John is steeped in many different traditions, including deep forms of Hinduism, Native American traditions, Taoism, and as I said, Tibetan Buddhism and others, deep nature. And I often find that going out on these passages, very often we're given themes or at least things to think about, and this brings you into a much deeper place. Typically, I would go out in nature, and as John says, I've done this many, many times. And sometimes I'd go out with a goal, I can't solve this personal problem, like I'm having trouble with this or that. And maybe I'm having some trouble with my work or personal difficulties, and I'd go out or maybe I just want to understand something. I've got some indication of some spiritual theme, and I go out there, and I'm quite determined to get to the bottom of this and get some answer. And my own experience is that happens very rarely. I don't get much of an answer. More likely, I go out and suddenly you're sitting there meditating, and some insight shows up, or maybe even occasionally some vision shows up, or you get a knowingness that of how something works. And it may have very, very little to do with with the animal you were out there hunting, you're with the theme that you were trying to understand. And I began to realize that you don't get as any lesson, you don't get what you want usually, you get what you need. And I've found that anything I go out there, and whether I plan it or not, I seem to get insights. And sometimes the insights are professional, but just as often there are insights about how the world works or how other dimensions work. And I don't know if I would sort of tick a box and say, well, I understand that. But over many, many times, I really appreciate what I've been shown, that there are other insights, that I'm surprised at what I'm shown and what other people are shown when I go out there. And I'm surprised very often that my idea of reality gets totally jarred. In Crestone, on the Sacred Land, I went out in 1995, and I was out there about 3 days on a 28-day kind of lunar cycle sacred passage. After about 4 days, I walked every day. I had to walk maybe half a mile on the side of the mountain to move a rock to show my companion, who might have been a mile away, that I was still alive, and this was our checkpoint. And I woke up one morning, there was a very large tree behind me, absolutely beautiful tree, and I saw that there was a rather strange tent. Could have been about 30 feet high. It was not a small tent, it was a large tent made of canvas. It had a rectangular opening at the top. And I suppose to let air in or whatever. ventilation. And I remember getting quite annoyed. I thought, this is private land. Somebody's put up a tent. This is a bit ridiculous. It was a huge tent. I thought, is this some sort of Boy Scout thing or what? But I thought, well, look, I'm on a private passage here. So I walked past the tent. As I walked past this tent, of course, the tent changed in perspective. It disappeared behind trees. And but I was quite annoyed by somebody coming in and disturbing
Yeah.
my vision and my peace. And nobody told me that there'd be a tent there.
Yeah, and this is called the Sacred Land Sanctuary. So it's a private reserve specifically set aside to honor the sacredness of nature,
Yeah,
the church, and be a place where only those that come to take a deep dive like you were into spiritual cultivation are welcome. And so that would make it triply annoying.
yeah. Anyway, I was quite put out by this, and luckily the next day, I thought, should I walk down the hill and investigate who's in the tent and whatnot? I decided not to. And next day it was gone. And at the end of the month, I said to John, I said, what sort of idiots came out and erected a tent? And John said, what tent? And this thing was large. I could see where it was dirty. I could see it was white tent. I could see what it was made of. I could see all the details.
Probably
But
was canvas, right?
Canvas tent, yeah, white canvas. Looked a bit old-fashioned. It wasn't sort of thing you would buy in REI. This was an industrial strength tent. And anyway, on a bit of questioning, it was what tent was the answer. And then I was looking casually through a book John owned on history of Crestone and in pictures, and there were pictures of this type of tent in the 1930s. There were miners there at the time, it's almost 100 years ago, and they had tents for doing assays, I imagine, little mini labs to see what they were getting out of the ground, or maybe just to direct the activities. There'd been a lot of mining in that area, and I was kind of blown away. Did this tent exist? Or because I had seen it, I felt I could touch it. This wasn't something shimmering in my imagination. It wasn't in my dreams. I was fully awake. Or did it not exist? And I've had many, many experiences like that, where I would say in full reality, something like that existed. In retrospect, in reality, it didn't exist. And so what do you make of that? This was, and I think one of the things that Sacred Passages did for me, and John in particular, was in an amused way, John used to sort of say, well, you think such and such is reality. Think again. One of the exercises you gave us, John, was we all trooped off to Kmart before the group of us, there were only 5 of us going out for a month, but you brought us to Kmart in those days and we bought clocks. The clocks in second hand. They were wall clocks, and we propped them up individually, of course, maybe against a rock, and we were supposed to sit and meditate for 2 hours in front of the clock, which I did. And nothing happened. I thought, this is the most boring thing I've ever done in my life. It was like being asked to watch,
You're just meditating on the movement of the second hand, as I recall.
Yeah, that's right. And the second hand didn't go smoothly. It went like this.
Yeah.
And it was like being asked to meditate on grass that was growing or paint that was drying or something. So I hated that exercise. And then after a few days, I was staring at this clock, and uh, and I noticed it was going bump, 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 and then it would stop. The second hand stopped,
Yes.
and then boom, boom. Now I had no watch. We're asked to do away with watches or cameras, or uh, there weren't cell phones in those days. This was 1995. Uh, but I couldn't quite believe this, so I thought maybe my consciousness somehow stopped. So I took my fingers on my pulse, and to time this, and the clock would go bum, 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 my pulse kept going, then the clock would stop. And then it would, then maybe after what might have been 10 or 15 seconds, my pulse kept going that whole time, but the clock stopped. Again, I couldn't make anything out of this, and my sense of time and sense of reality were quite badly shaken up, or maybe in a very good way. In the end, I will say this, I don't quite know what reality really is. In a good way, that, you think you know something, you think you're in this dimension, and then very directly in these passages we were shown that you can't trust any form of reality. It's as if you knock a wall and you bash your fist against a brick wall, and then you find out 2 days later that wall never existed. So I've never solved the problem, but
Good,
it
good.
it loosened my dogmatic idea of what reality is. That
Yeah,
much I would say.
we all have a pretty deep attachment to what Carlos Castaneda's teacher called consensus
Mm.
reality or consensual reality, which was the idea that um, most humans have a fairly fixed idea of how things are and what reality is. And that consensual belief system is actually what locks us into to a frame which prevents us from experiencing other possibilities.
Hmm.
And the way of nature's process, what I've come to call the way of nature process, actually helps you to release the addiction to the consensual view and to drop into a much more open, deeply present, very spacious state of being, which is akin to one's true nature or source nature. And because you freed up from all the belief systems, and you're starting to experience kind of pure experience, and many different kinds of forms begin to manifest in that space and presence. There's a freedom there for many other possibilities.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons that when you drop into that, that space that you first encounter when you release the addiction to consensual reality, then immense creativity begins to arise. And because you're no longer limited by the consensual agreements that you've adopted since you were a child. And suddenly you begin to have a very fresh series of experiences and creative insight into what before were insoluble problems actually become it's very simple. And you see, oh, of course,
Yeah.
you've had that many times. Brian.
This is true. And I would often go out there, as I said, I'd go out there hoping to solve some problem. More than once, I've gone out on a sacred passage where I was just furious. It's somebody had written something nasty in a newspaper about my work or something, and I was just furious. And I never fully resolved any of those problems, John.
Yeah.
You're just meant to suffer through those sorts of things and maybe get a tougher skin than I had. But what I did get was, I think, over many, many, many years, and that's been 30 years, a much deeper understanding of different dimensions. I was shown, for example, and I won't explain what I mean here, I was shown that the Tao, or the Tao, or source, if you want, is fibrous. And I could maybe tell you what that means, and I'm not even sure what it means, but I was just given one insight after another over many years, dozens of insights, until you kind of more and more deeply discover that there are other dimensions that our consciousness doesn't always have much access to, but nevertheless, those dimensions exist. And forces exist in those dimensions, other beings or other consciousnesses exist. And you're brought into these consciousnesses and sometimes shown how some aspect of the world works. I would not have predicted that. I mean, let me put it another way. In my work, and this is true of most people, we learn an awful lot by reading. So we want to know about the world, we read, or we watch CNN, or we watch, or we read blogs, or we talk to people and we get pretty good insights. You know, how does deep learning and artificial intelligence work? And you can read all that sort of stuff. But here I was entering a world where there were no books. I wasn't bringing out books to these retreats, not at all. I was on my own. And yet I found I was learning a tremendous amount, sitting there meditating, and you get some realization. I often felt I was given a realization. And like many other people in such a circumstance, I was given visions. And as I said, over many years, excuse me, I felt I was learning a lot about what Carlos Castaneda called an alternate reality. There are alternate realities in different dimensions, and there isn't that much you can read. You could read the many sutras, or again, Carlos Castaneda, someone like that, but you will not get very direct experience of an alternate reality. So it was like being transported to another dimension, to another world, and then shown around in this world. And then you come back and you discover, you come back to the standard world. And John would always say to us when we come out, was, welcome back, John would say, to unreality. And I thought, this is great. And John would say, what happened out there, Brian? And I would say, nothing happened, John, every time. And yet I found my understanding of things would get deeper and deeper. And this indeed applied to my work. Most people who do serious research have problems that they can't solve. They tuck these problems away over many decades, maybe, and they think, if I ever get an insight, maybe I could solve such and such. And I found that my own standard work, my day-to-day work in research, began to get deeper and deeper. And I became, over that time, less mechanical, less relying on technical methods, and much more philosophical. And I discovered with this sort of practice, going out in nature and going in the way of nature, I discovered that maybe as I got older, I'm not young anymore, but maybe as I got older, my IQ has fallen a good few points. I don't know. But my ability to understand things sharpened like crazy. And I once asked my teacher, who was a martial arts master, trained in the Ip Man school, where Bruce Lee had trained in Hong Kong. And I said to him, I said, Sifu, I said, as you got better and better at martial arts, did you understand more and more techniques, from maybe 20 or 50, maybe to several hundred moves or techniques that you could do? And he said, no, doesn't work that way. And I said, oh, how does it work then? He said, as you get more and more mastery, he said, you lose techniques. You begin to realize what's truly important. And then you feel there are very, very few things that are important. The other things are more embroidery. And if someone's coming at you full tilt, you don't have time to think, I should use technique number 152 or something. You react from some very deep instinctive place.
Yeah.
Using something extremely simple. So the world simplifies, but you're given a wisdom that in that world that's simple, you get an instinctive wisdom for how things truly are. And without thinking, automatically you can, it just seems to arise that you do the correct thing.
Yeah, the appropriate response arises naturally and spontaneously when the training is going very deep and you begin to access the creative core of your being. And then the appropriate response arises very naturally and spontaneously. In Taoism, there's a beautiful concept that Chuang-Tzu especially put a lot of emphasis on. We're doing a training right now, that 4-year training that we're finishing up, 2 years of shadow work, and then a year of direct pointing out of source, and then a 4th year of resting in that recognition of true nature aspect, while it embroiled in normal, everyday, normally distracting and contracting activities. And what we begin to discover is that if you really apply profound levels of presence and profound levels of letting go, which in Chinese systems might be called Sung and Ting, then a natural process of spontaneous flow of life experience enters, and you begin to respond to life from a very deep and naturally spontaneous kind of wisdom.
Yeah.
It's often called Wu, pronounced Wu, spelled W-U-W-E-I, but pronounced Wu. And so we happen to be in the year of celebrating Wu right now.
I want to add one thing, if I may, and that is that, see if I can get my head around this for a moment. I think that I found that with sacred, you were asking about creativity, and I found that with sacred passages, the kind of system that you designed, I might go out there with a question or a problem in mind, and quite often I would get an answer. But I found that there was a rhythm that for the first few days, your mind was going like crazy, and that annoyances and things you hadn't processed came up. I think your metaphor, John, was that all the stuff that lay at the bottom of the well, all the bits and pieces of wood or something had fallen into the well, all the crap, whatever it was, came up and started to float. And the first few days were usually quite difficult because you're processing things you hadn't processed before, some of which were quite toxic. And then I found that there was a natural rhythm after a few days that would get processed, and you go down to some much deeper level. And at that deep level, true insights arose. And you didn't have to really ask. It was more that the things that you were puzzling about, maybe your subconscious had worked on, and the subconscious, maybe over many months or maybe spontaneously during the solo, came up with answers. And then when you came back into the standard world, you could implement those answers. I used to think with sacred passages, do I have the time? Can I afford to take 2 weeks off or a month off and go and sit in the middle of a bunch of trees and be bored out of my mind and see a bunch of animals and occasionally encounter ones that I didn't want to encounter that were downright scary? And why would anyone do that? And you're starving half the time, and sometimes you're cold and other times you're wet, and why bother? But I discovered that this was not time in any way that was wasted. And I think that I absorbed all that. And I want to tell a quick story here that 1999, now this is quite a while ago, I was contacted by two people, Joseph Jaworski, who I sent later to do sacred passages, and they were roughly from the MIT Society of Learning project, Peter Senge. But Jaworski and a young guy called Otto Scharmer contacted me, wanted to talk to me, came here to this building where I work, Xerox Park, and I said, what do you want to talk to me about? And they said, you made a remark that if you want to solve a difficult problem, I think I'd said this in a business magazine called Fast Company. Fast Company had asked me, how do you solve very difficult problems? Ones like, not ones, how do I redirect my supply chain or something, that were more mechanical, but truly difficult ones. Do I close down my company? Should I merge? Or even personal ones. Should I marry? Should I be divorced? Should we have more children? Whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And those are deep problems. And I'd made some remark in that magazine on how to solve that. It was 1999. And Jaworski said, we're truly interested. And I said, and I think this was very much inspired by my experiences doing sacred passages. I said, if you have a truly difficult problem, there's a process that comports with Asian spiritual thinking, especially Taoist thinking. If an artist wants to paint a landscape, the artist sits in front of the landscape. This would be traditional, maybe over many hundreds of years, 1300s. An artist would sit maybe on a ledge somewhere and for 2 weeks just stare at the landscape. And then they would go into a deep meditation. And excuse me, and from that meditation, having got all the information and staring at the landscape and thinking about that and seeing it in different lights, they would be able to work from this very deep place and let the picture emerge. They wouldn't paint the picture, they'd let the picture emerge itself. And I said, I think this is true in very deep decisions in life, that there's a kind of a U process where you go down and down and come up the other side. And I think passages work very much that way. You might go out there and you're thinking, well, maybe I should do this, should do that. But then you get somewhere truly deep, you stop thinking about collecting data or collecting different opinions or impressions. You just let go and you're in some deeper place. And magically from that deeper place, solutions emerge. So you were saying earlier, John, that this is a place of great creativity. It's absolutely true. I think creativity myself, I think that that does not come from thinking harder. It comes from having thought hard before and then
Like,
letting go.
yes,
Isaac Newton's, was asked how did he get his laws of planetary orbits, and he, we tend to think it's an act of genius. It isn't. Newton said by thinking on it continuously, and he meant thinking maybe for months or years, and then sweating, but then you let go. And I noticed this is really what happened in sacred passages. So I said to Jaworski and Otto Scharmer, I think this is a process by which all these truly difficult decisions get made. Well, they recorded all this for 6 hours, and and I saw them off waved them off from the reception area at Xerox Park where I was working. And apparently they went out into the car park, and Otto Scharmer says to Joseph Jaworski, he says, we've got something here. And the pair of them turned this very famously now into what they call the U process.
mm,
And this is now, I think they've got hundreds of thousands of followers in
yeah,
business and all across the world in U process. They've been kind enough in both their books to acknowledge that if I didn't invent this, at least I midwifed it
yeah.
for them, and I think they've done something tremendous.
Are
But
they doing some good work?
what I want to point out is that I think the inspiration for this way of thinking comes out of passages, sacred passages. You're wrestling with stuff in the real world, you're wrestling in your conscious mind, you're trying to grapple, get more information, talk to people, think about it, and go like that. And then in a sacred passage, you let go. And then true creativity, and I think it arises from deeper dimensions, wells up. You can't guarantee it. You can't snap your fingers and say, I will now be creative. I will now solve a problem. But then things come up. And very quickly you find you can execute. And I've found this again and again and again in my own life. I'm
Well,
not the only one. I think an awful lot of people report that this sort of thing
yeah,
happens.
we've probably could have quite a few stories following what we've been sharing today along that same line. And it's interesting. The wave of nature process is classically back in the day when you were getting started with it. It was the awareness training in the beginning where you
Yes, yes.
really take a deep look at what's up for you, uh, where you're going, and you begin to apply a number of practices and techniques to help you begin to refine your understanding of things, and in our case, also to refine your connection to nature, outer nature, and inner nature, and true nature.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
these are ways of really unraveling some of the complexity that fills our lives, so that we can arrive at a more simple state of being. And then, of course, you drop. The second part is dropping deeply into inner stillness of the body, the silence of the normally busy mind, and the spaciousness of one's essence, and becoming really well established in that. And as you say, then this fountainhead of creativity just arises naturally. It's always been there. It's just now suddenly it's you're aware of it. And then the third part is when you come back out of the period of solitude. We used to call it the solo time. We now call it, because you're not alone, you're with all kinds of living beings. The all one time solo. But when you come out of that, then you integrate, you spend a period of time with some helpful tools, we hope, and processes like tempering.
Mhm.
it helps you to integrate what you've been given through this upwelling of insight from the deep sources of your true nature. And the process of integration and then stabilizing that insight to some degree it has become a very important part of the process. So those 3 steps were kind of our early version of the U process in the
Mhm.
way of nature process. By the way, we discovered 2 more levels to it since then, those early days. We now say that the process, the U-shaped process for the way of nature,
Mhm.
starts when somebody says, I'm going to do one of these crazy retreats, a sacred passage or a nature quest or renewal program. And as soon as they make that commitment and set their intent to do it, all the reasons why you shouldn't start coming up and flooding into
Really?
your life. And
Yeah.
all these are your initial tests to see if you're really there, if you're really ripe and ready to take that deep dive into your truth. And so we call that now the stage 1 of the process. And then after you've gone through the awareness training, the deep drop into the base of the U and the deep opening of source, or coming very close to source, and the creativity upwelling, then you come out and you go through the integration stage. Some of the tempering, by the way, is a process in integration where you go back and forth from your solo camp where
Yeah.
you establish that creative upwelling, and then you go back out maybe to Walmart or
Yeah.
some downtown cafe, or maybe there's a band playing on the street.
Yes.
You're immediately pulled back into consensual reality,
Yeah.
and you begin to feel like you're losing what you received, all this creativity, that's beautiful inner stillness and silence and spaciousness. You learn to apply relaxation and deep presence in the activity of those outward circumstances, and that you begin to sense how you naturally begin to recontract and distract. Then you go back into your solo site and once again regain internally and externally that inner source of creativity, and you realize, it's still there. It's always been there.
Yeah.
You go back out and see if you can maintain and stabilize in the context of normally a busy outward life.
Yeah.
And you go back and forth like that, just like you temper a sword into the flame, out of
Yeah.
hammer into the cold water, cools down, back into the flame. And that's how you temper a sword. So it becomes so refined, you can move like that with a piece of tissue paper floating in the air, and it slices you through the tissue paper cleanly without any effort whatsoever.
Yeah.
So we call that the tempering stage of the process, which is part of our integration. And then the new fifth stage is when you go back home and you've applied the tempering and the integration processes deeply. We come back together after a month or two, and we revisit where you're at and how the tempering process has gone when you enter your fully normal life with family, friends, enemies, workplace, normal distractions of the culture, all the normal turmoil that many of us experience in our normal daily lives. Have you been able to integrate in that context? And that's kind of the fifth and final graduation phase of the process. And we now do those 5 steps in everything we do, be it a short program or a very long program like the 28 or 44-day all one-time advanced training retreats. But well, thanks for your sharing, Brian. That's beautiful. That really encapsulates the process, the way of nature process beautifully.
Yeah. What was the first
First is where
thing
you
where
set
you're
your
tested? Yeah.
intention to, I'm gonna do this, like some of the viewers here today who are watching this or hearing this
Hmm.
on a podcast say, wow, this sounds amazing.
Hmm.
What an opportunity, what an invitation to open up and tap into my pure creative source. And here's a way to do it that's been
Hmm.
developed. It also does it in the context of bonding with nature. So I'm also receiving kind of a set of insights that have to do with contributing to a more sustainable kind of life, given what's going on with the planet right now, like climate change. And I'd like to do this amazing thing. So, and then they say, well, I'm going to do it. When is the next one coming up? So they call in, and maybe Brad, who's doing a wonderful job in supporting this
Yeah.
recording today, and also receives many of the requests coming in from people who are interested in doing a program. They go on the website, findwayofnature.com, and then eventually probably reach Brad. And then they say, I want to do this. I listen to this amazing sharing that was really inspired me. And so I'm in. Now, as soon as they set the intent to do it, all the reasons why they should not do it begin to flood into their experience.
Yeah.
Everyone goes through this.
Yeah.
I've been doing it. I think I might have done a few more even than you, Brian.
I'd say so.
And I still, even though I began at age 4, and I still have that period of the doubts, the resistances, the reasons. No, I can't do this right now. I have to wait maybe another season or another year. All the different reasons why I can't. So the 5 steps begin with that first one of, that's your test to see whether you're really ripe and ready, and you are beginning the process that you process at that early stage when you set your intent to go through the entire thing.
Yeah.
Then all the reasons why you can't. If you can pass through that and then arrive to receive some of the practices and principles that allow you to begin to simplify the complexity of your life, so you can arrive at that inner stillness, soundness, and space. Then, of course, that means you can really be there for the awareness training part and begin to address all these complex problems and issues that you have in your life. And then that gives you the perfect background to drop into the base itself.
That's
So
beautiful.
it's a process.
Lovely. Wow.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, it's great to see you. We had some really wonderful time this summer here at the Sacred
Yeah.
Sanctuary. I always like to honor the fact that, as far as I know, the Sacred Land Sanctuary is one of the very first examples of modern, what do we call modern humans, Brian? Digital hominids?
I don't know.
Even industrial doesn't quite do it anymore.
Yeah.
Urbano, industrio, techno, digito,
something
modern,
something like that.
virtual,
I would
virtual,
just
virtual reality.
I would just use one word, John, and that's distracted.
And a bit contracted often.
Yeah, contracted and distracted.
Yes. Or unfortunate modern challenge.
Yeah.
But there are ways to move through that, to move through the illusion of the pain body, as they put it in Buddhism,
Yeah.
and to arrive at that amazing vastness and spaciousness of our true nature, which is always there. It's never been harmed.
Yeah.
It never goes away. It is never subject to the normal suffering of our normal consensual experience of life. So our invitation is really to embrace some of these ways of simply dropping into that deep inner truth and enjoying that beautiful upwelling of creative resolution that arises when you begin to drop into your true nature. You were mentioning, by the way, that this year it was beginning to stabilize for you, being able to really rest in that true inner nature of your being. And I can't tell you how happy that made me to hear
Yeah.
that it arrived for you.
I think there's you go through years of efforting, and suddenly it's like everything, all the props fall away, and you're simply there, and you can sit down pretty well anywhere and go into very, very deep spaces.
That's right.
I must say, John, if I may make a remark or two,
Sure.
just to finish up with, you showed me many, many things, but one thing was extremely important, and that was that nature itself is a profound teacher.
Yes.
And that's not something I understood or would have thought of when I met you. In other words, you go out in nature and you sort of think, well, nature's what causes um, cold or rain or thunderstorms or trees surrounding you or animals intruding. And but no, nature itself, by some means I to this day don't understand, teaches you. It's a it's a fantastic teacher. I think maybe it's that we're going back to our own true place in the world.
Absolutely. We're
And
learning how to re-indigenize ourselves
yeah,
in
and
a way that,
I would never have thought in advance consciously that that was the case. I was drawn into your program in nature by instinct. The
mm,
moment I met you, I sort of thought, "Oh, this is it. Yes, that's it.
mm,
I don't need it." The
super.
other thing I would say is, John, as a result, this changed my life. And in fact, you changed my life. So I want to thank you.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
thank you for showing up. It's been a great joy to spend the time together over the years.
it's been really rewarding. I was going to say fun. Of course, it's been great fun, but it's been
And to be
rewarding.
a true brother in Irish humor.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Brian, and it's been great. I should probably mention that if you're interested in following up with any of this stuff, you can go to the www.wayofnature.com,
Yes.
what we're up to, and have a taste of what we've been sharing about today with Brian. Um, thank you again, Brian. This has really been a great pleasure to spend some time with you today. I'm delighted we're both still alive and able to share together.
And thank you, John.
Yeah,
Thanks not just for this session, but for 30 years of your teaching.
yeah,
Thank you.
my pleasure.
Okay.
Okay, we'll see you soon.
Bye.